celebrate food and travel writer. We also have Mr. Sumit Das Gupta along with us, who is a senior editor turned entrepreneur, who was with the ABP Group in Calcutta for 24 years. Off to you, Mr. Das.
Thank you, Shivangi. So first things first, Vir, welcome to ABP Education, which is the tiny tot in the house of ABP, a house where you spent more than a decade in the 80s and 90s. Your first thoughts on being back in Calcutta and ABP virtually, of course, with a bunch of students for company. Your first thoughts, please.
Well, the obvious thing, Sumit. First of all, obviously, I'm glad to do this, but I would have been much happier if we didn't have this damn pandemic hanging over our heads, and I could have done this live. I could have come to Calcutta, which remains a city I love, and I could have interacted with the students and with the audience. That would have been much more fun, but we shall make the most of what we have.
Absolutely. Thank you, Vir. So, A Rude Life, the memoir by Mr. Vir Sanghvi, published by Penguin, is a must read for all those in the audience today. Anybody aspiring to be a journalist, anybody who is a journalist, and anybody who's curious about India should be reading this book. It is a kind of rapid reader on India then and now, and also, of course, on journalism yesterday, today, and tomorrow, which is the topic of discussion. And there couldn't be anybody more appropriate than Vir, because from magazine to newspaper, television to Twitter, political writing to food writing, Vir has done it all. So what we will do is pick up a few relevant portions from the book, which will be of particular relevance to the audience today. And I'll request Vir to elaborate on those. I'll start with when you started out, Vir. You write that in that era, everyone tried to write like Khushwant Singh. I know of many young journalists, myself included, who tried to write like Vir Sanghvi. And that was a style which was conversational, which was chatty, which was free of jargon, easy flowing. So my first question is, did that style of writing come easily and naturally to you? Or were you conscious of kind of following that kind of writing?
Well, first of all, it's kind of you to say that. I don't think it's true. I don't think I've ever had the kind of influence that Khushwant Singh had. But I think the point worth making is that Khushwant Singh had one style. Everything was written from the point of view of a raconteur. I went here, I met so-and-so, they said this to me, I asked for a bottle of whiskey. So this kind of stuff worked, I think, when Khushwant Singh did it. It didn't work when everybody else did it. And it didn't work in any case in all situations. I started my career working for India Today. And we were all trained then to try and write like Time magazine. You know, those very strange sentences, as the saying goes, backward ran sentences until reeled the mind. And, you know, if you described somebody, you had to describe what his age was. Said so-and-so 56, about the 202 feet submarine or something like that. So that was a good training because it taught you to be precise. It taught you how to take yourself out of the story to try and put it across as objectively as possible. And I think in Sunday, when I did news reports often, or stories, cover stories describing what was happening when we worked together, I didn't always sign them, but I used that style. But the style I use for my signed columns, and these days I don't do much reporting, so it's only signed columns and all of that, is conversation. And to be fair to Khushwant Singh, I suppose he was in his own way conversational. That was the way he talked. This is the way I talk. I always believe that when you write, unless you're writing for a magazine with a straight format, or you're doing a news report that requires you to follow the classic pyramid structure, basically the secret is to write like you talk. That's all you need to do.
Since you mentioned Time, you write that we learned on the job by perusing back issues of Time and Newsweek. So what should aspiring journalists today read, apart from a Rude Life, of course?
Thank you. Thanks. I'm not sure they should read that. But see, Time and Newsweek were created in America in an era when there were lots of newspapers, and they were created essentially not for people who read all the newspapers and knew what was happening. They were created for people who didn't necessarily read the newspapers, but wanted to know in one easy capsule once a week what had been happening. If you look at the success of India Today, and the success of India Today really starts from the 80s, continues through the 90s, and then tapers off. It's still a very good magazine and a successful magazine, but it's no longer essential reading for everyone. Also coincided with the rise of a new middle class. There were people who'd been brought up in homes where there were no newspapers. They now had money. They mixed in circles where they had to seem well informed. Not true in Calcutta, by the way, where everybody always read newspapers, but certainly true in the rest of India. And India Today gave them a way of reading what was happening, written clearly. It was written in very good English. I know many Punjabi children who were told to read India Today to learn how to write in the way that a whole generation of Bengalis was taught, God forbid, to read the Statesman to learn how to write. So India Today was very much a creature of those times. I said then, and people didn't agree with me, that people who didn't like reading newspapers probably didn't like reading anyway. And that the moment television came along, India Today would be less and less relevant to these people, which is pretty much what happened. By the beginning of this century, everybody was watching 24/7, and then later all the other channels. They were finding out easily what was happening without having to read a word. So I think India Today lost its importance. Now I think is a very different kind of world in which people read not to be well informed because there are many other sources of information. They read to be thought-provoked, to be provoked into thinking. They read sometimes to be entertained. So if you write now, I don't think there is any one Bible, anything. You take your style, you suit it to whatever you're doing, and you write, as always, like you speak.
Okay. There's a slightly longish sentence, so I'll read it out. You say that the best training for journalism is to try and make a dull subject sound interesting to an audience that cares as little about it as you used to before you wrote the article.
Yeah.
So how does a youngster starting out make a dull subject sound interesting to the uninterested?
Well, I think that is the real challenge, because if you're interested in something, let's take something as mundane as, say, Shah Rukh Khan. Assuming I like Shah Rukh Khan and I'm writing for an audience of Shah Rukh Khan fans, which at one stage was most of India, perhaps still is. You don't have to try that hard, no? Because no matter how badly you write or whatever you do, people are fascinated by Shah Rukh Khan. You like Shah Rukh Khan. So you will manage to convey that and people will read it anyhow. But if you open a newspaper, it won't be about Shah Rukh Khan. But there will be some article on violence in Mizoram or something about some water project that has not worked out and therefore there is tension. Now, when you have those kind of articles, they're important, and that's why the paper carries them. They're not instinctively appealing. It's not stuff that people want to read. But you know that people need to read that because we need to be informed about our world. So the challenge for you is to try and make that, first of all, not just interesting, but also understandable. I think what's wrong with a lot of journalism now is, with a lot of writing, is people forget that journalism is about communication. You're there to get a message across. If you can organize your facts, if you can get that message across, and you can do it in an interesting manner, you're okay.
And for the youngsters in this audience, you started out really young, and as you write, even before you were an undergraduate, you had about 25 bylines in India Today.
Yeah.
So on cue, I would like to bring in Shruti Sen Gupta, who is a student of mass communication, who has a question for you. Shruti?
Sure. Hi, Shruti.
A very good afternoon to everyone here. I'm Shruti Sen Gupta. I'm from St. Xavier's, Kolkata. I'm pursuing mass communication and videography. My question is on behalf of the students of mass communication, students like me. Would you advise us to pursue a higher education degree in mass communication or to gain work experience as soon as possible?
Look, I'm a bad example because I never ever studied mass media. I never studied communications. When I hired people at Sunday and later for television, I was not particularly impressed by journalism degrees. Some excellent people have come out of journalism schools and some excellent people have come out without a journalism. Sumit, did you ever study journalism? No. Like Sumit is probably one of the brightest people I ever hired when I worked in Calcutta, and I worked for Sunday, and he had no journalism degree. So I don't reckon that a journalism degree is in any way essential to becoming a good journalist. On the other hand, it's foolish to deny that it helps. It helps, it teaches you many of the basics. And also, if you look at the world today, it isn't as simple as it was in the days when Sumit was starting out, let alone on the days when I was starting out, because you just had to write. You didn't really require that many technical skills. Now you're dealing with the web, you're dealing with television, you're dealing with visual media. There are technical skills that you require. And I think any kind of education that gives you those skills puts you at an advantage. So yes, a first degree in journalism is probably useful, but once you've got it and you've learned the basics, get the hell out of there and get some experience in the real world.
This is also something that constantly came to us, that whether internships and job experience was more important, or being in the classroom. So absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Once the basics are done, start as soon as possible.
Yeah.
I'll pick up one episode while you were starting out, which is the George Harrison interview.
Right.
You managed to get an exclusive and potentially explosive interview with the Beatles star, and you used a lot of common sense in getting it, and you also use an interesting sentence to describe it. You say it helped to be a rock nerd when you were dealing with rock stars.
Yeah.
So going forward, once the basics are done, do you think it is better to focus on specializing in things that you are interested in and passionate about?
See, my view on journalism is that nobody becomes a journalist to make money. You can make money by doing many other things. When I finished at university, there were many other things I could have done. One proposal for me to become what was then called a merchant banker, which would now be called an investment banker. Another proposal was to go to Hong Kong and work in a multinational company, in which case I'd have made much more money than I would ever have made in journalism. So the only reason, there's only one real reason for doing journalism, and that is that you like it. There's no point doing it otherwise. Go off and sell ball bearings or whatever and make much more money than you would in journalism. So if you are going to do journalism and you're not going to do it for economic reasons, then do it because you think, A, perhaps you can make a difference with what you write. You can make the world a better place, which sounds grandiose, but at its basic level is not such a bad thing. Or B, do it because you enjoy it, because you write about the things that you like. You learn more about them because you're a journalist. That is actually the only motivation that matters in journalism. Otherwise, go and sell ball bearings.
And now, for many years, you've been wearing two very different and distinctive hats, that of a political columnist and a food writer.
Yeah.
You clearly said that you do both because you enjoy doing both.
Yeah.
Is it, how do you divide it up in your mind? Are there days or phases when you'd rather be writing about politics and then you switch off and switch on the lifestyle and food mode, or how does it work for somebody doing both?
See, the way it works is my political column now is on the net. It's on ht.com. And it's a weekly column, but it's not a column on a specific day, if you see what I mean. In that, if something dramatic happens today, I'll do the piece. It'll go out. The net is so quick. It'll be out in an hour or so, and we will be on top of the situation. So that is hardly ever a problem, because nearly every week something or the other happens. Something provokes you. If it's not Pegasus, it's something else, and you write about it, and it goes out. The food column, on the other hand, goes in every Thursday and appears not that Sunday, the following Sunday. So it's an impossible deadline, and you have to keep it. So the food column sometimes is a struggle, because you have to find something that people will want to read about, yet you have to find something that's not too lowest common denominator. Ultimately, if people in the business, if chefs and people like that, do not respect you, you won't get access. If you do what so many food bloggers do, the standard food piece, you'll get so far, but not much further. So therefore, the political stuff usually comes out of passion, or because I'm on top of something that's happening. The food stuff has now become routine.
And you also mentioned that increasingly it is impossible practically to sustain yourself with only hard news in India. Where do you think this set in, and where do you think this is going?
I think generally all over the world, news is in some level of decline. Opinion is rising. If you look at the American model, where many small towns first had 2 papers, then 1 paper, and now have no papers at all. The small town newspaper is dead. Many big cities outside of New York, which is probably luckier than most, have only 1 paper of any consequence. So part of that comes from the fact that people are moving away from newspapers, and sometimes they're moving away from news because there are other ways of doing it. On the other hand, there is a hardcore that does news abroad, like otherwise CNN and Fox News, for instance, are both immensely profitable channels, which means there must still be money in doing that. Sadly, that's not true in India. Most news channels struggle to survive, and in an effort to survive, often they redefine news. A lot of what appears on Hindi channels, I don't know how many you watch them, would not be considered news anywhere but in a parallel universe. But they do it because it's entertaining. A lot of English channels where you have these anchors who are like ringmasters and these guys who fight with each other from little windows. I mean, that is not what news television is anywhere in the world. Even Fox News is an island of sanity compared to what we have in India. So it struck me then that there was this space which was either changing in ways that I couldn't cope with. I have no desire to appear in the window and shout at people. Or it was changing in ways that made it more and more economically difficult. That news alone was not enough to sustain yourself. You had to look at where the market was going. And research will tell you that anywhere when a middle class makes money in any country of the world, one of the first things it spends money on is food, on travel. So if I had an aptitude and an interest in being able to do that, why not write about it? I could perhaps in some way monetize an interest and find a way of making a living.
And I'll just rewind to the political part of your journalism. Among the 9, I counted the 9 prime ministers that you've known very closely and interviewed. Who would you rank the highest and why?
Oh, it's very difficult to say because they were all good in different ways. The one I got along most with, and I think history has done massive injustices to, was Chandrasekhar, who I thought was a really good prime minister, but because of circumstances, he didn't last. Easily the worst was VP Singh, who turned out to be venal, who introduced Mandal only to support himself and to support his lifestyle. The person I probably saw the most of was A.B. Vajpayee because I was often at his house. So I liked him enormously as a person because he was so decent and so normal. The man I found the most likable was clearly Rajiv Gandhi. The one with whom I had a sort of up and down relationship, though I often attacked him in print, we never stopped talking, was Narasimha Rao. And the one I don't know very well is Narendra Modi. I knew him before he became Prime Minister, but he's not actually keen on giving much access or speaking to journalists. So I haven't seen much of him since he has become Prime Minister. The Manmohan Singh of UPA 1, I thought was an outstanding Prime Minister. The Manmohan Singh of UPA 2 was a disaster. So there are no simple answers. They're good and bad in different ways.
I'm just curious, if you compare a political column with a food column, what kind of responses do you get?
It's funny. I mean, it's very hard to say what it is. I remember when I started Root Food, which is my food column, when I was editor of the Hindustan Times, and the column caught on. Arun Jaitley, who was my friend, who was a politician, said to me, you do realize that a time will come, 2 years from now maybe, when you will be known as a food journalist and not as a serious editor. And I think he meant this as a criticism. And I said, I'm perfectly fine to be known as a food journalist. So yeah, I get different responses. I get responses from people in the world of food who don't know about the political stuff. I spoke to one of India's best known, most famous politicians about 3 or 4 years ago, and she had no idea that I wrote about food. So in some ways, these are self-contained compartments.
So on that note, I'd like to bring in Raj Lakshmi, who has a question specifically on this for you. Raj Lakshmi? You're on mute. Raj Lakshmi, you're on mute. I understand you're nervous. You're on mute.
Very good afternoon, sir. This is Raj Lakshmi speaking. I am a postgraduate student of Christ University, Bangalore, and I'm currently pursuing a course in Media and Communication Studies. And my question to you today is, since I aspire to be a food and travel writer, which is not what a normal journalism student actually goes for, how should I prepare myself to gain a boosting career? What should I watch? What should I listen to? What should I read?
Basically, you should just read. I think there's no substitute for reading. 90% of everything I've learned in my life, I have learned from books or through reading. One of the great tragedies of modern life is that people feel they know it all, or even worse, that they can Google it and find out what they need to do. Nobody reads for the joy of reading. And often when you read for joy, you learn a lot that is not just joyous or joy making, it's certainly useful. If you look at my Kindle today, something like 80% of the books on it are non-fiction. And there are things I'm interested in, like food, like travel, food, all the stuff you talk about, a lot of biographies. And I find I've learned a lot about the world from them. If I sit down to write, I have reference points, which are not necessarily from my own experience, that are from books. So you talk about travel. If I was to go to, as I did go a few years ago, to Angkor Wat in Cambodia, which the world sees as a Buddhist temple, but actually the older part of it is a Hindu temple, and you can go and see all of that. It doesn't make sense to you unless you've read up about it. And if you just sort of Googled it before going, it still won't make sense. But if you read books about it, you've read books about how Hinduism spread to Southeast Asia, then it makes sense to you. So reading would be the answer. Watching is hardly ever the answer. Just read and learn from reading.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Raj.
So we've read a lot on print and tips for young aspiring writers, journalists, reporters. A lot of youngsters now will directly go into the visual medium.
Yeah.
For them, what kind of homework or what kind of advice would you have to host lots of youngsters? First thing they do is start hosting small chat shows among friends and peer group, and then among a larger group. So to anchor chat shows, to be on visual medium, what kind of tips would you have for them?
Well, anchoring a chat show in many ways is the most difficult thing to do, because you have to engage and interest the guy or woman you're talking to, make them feel you're interested in them, get them to open up. But you can't really cater only to their interests. You also have to cater to the interests of your audience. So doing a chat show is, in a sense, building a balance between the needs and interests of your audience and making your guest feel comfortable. If you just tell people what they already know when you do a chat show, it doesn't really help. People want to be surprised. They want to learn new things from a chat show. So you need to keep that in mind always. Too often now, when people do interviews, they become like weightlifter or bodybuilder competitions in which the anchor starts shouting at the guest or starts asking very tough questions to indicate how macho he or she is. Nobody really cares. They'll watch it as a circus. They'll watch it as a spectacle or as a bodybuilding show. But it's not journalism. They won't learn anything from it. The thing to remember when you do a chat show is very rarely do people watch the chat show for the anchor. They watch it for the guest. Your duty as an anchor, in your job description, in fact, is to get the best out of your guest. If you can get the best out of your guest on a regular basis, then yes, people will watch it for you, but only because of what you do with the guests. It's true certainly of political shows, but it's true of light shows as well. Why do people watch Coffee with Karan? long before Karan Johar came along, many people had hosted programs in which film stars were interviewed and spoke interestingly perhaps. But Karan had that ability to go where nobody had gone before, to ask the questions that nobody had asked before. And I accept that some of this is because he's an insider, because he himself is a powerful person. But he managed to get stars to say things that nobody had said before. So now you would watch Coffee with Karan regardless of who the guest is, because you would think he would get something out of the guest. And 9 times out of 10, he does. So that's a successful talk show outside of the political space.
But actually, you've done with chat shows, which I don't think will be repeated ever. I think on one day, it was Shah Rukh Khan and Amitabh Bachchan back to back.
That's right, yes. Raveena Tandon, Shah Rukh Khan, Amitabh Bachchan, and Priyanka Chopra. Same day in the studio.
Same day.
Same day, yeah.
That's insane.
Of which only Amitabh Bachchan and Raveena were planned. Shah Rukh and Priyanka were bonuses.
And what do you remember of that day? Because
well, it's quite a crazy day, because this was a show, for all of you who probably weren't born when it was shown. It was a show called Star Talk, which I used to do for what was then called the Star News Channel, and which is now metamorphosed into NDTV 24/7. And this was a show that came out once a week. It was repeated 4 or 5 times, but it was a weekly show in which we talked to somebody of interest. Sometimes it was a movie star, sometimes it was a politician, but we didn't discriminate. We did the first interview Sonia Gandhi ever gave, but the following week we did Sonali Bendre. So as far as we were concerned, there was no snobbery involved. Everybody was the same. So Amitabh Bachchan is probably our most frequent guest. Probably we did the most number of episodes with him. And the way it would work is, if we went to Bombay, we would go to a studio, we would hire a studio, and we would erect our set, and we would do interviews there. Now, this was obviously an expensive process. So we would try and shoot as many interviews as we could on the same day to, amortize the cost of the travel, of the unit, of the set, etc. So Amitabh Bachchan, I think, was due for an interview. So I called him and I said, can we do an interview? And he said, no, I'm sorry, I've given my dates to Karan Johar. I'm shooting Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum, which is an old Karan Johar movie, and I won't be able to get away. So I said, don't you have breaks in between? So he suggested, and it was a good idea. He said, look, you're going to hire a studio anyway. So why not hire a studio in the same studio complex where I am shooting with Karan? There will be an hour or an hour and a half during the shooting of the song sequence where I'm not required. I'll come and do your interview. So it seemed good. So we did that. We needed at least one more to make it economical. So we asked Raveena to come in, and she came in and she gave a terrific interview. And we waited for Amitabh Bachchan, who was very gracious and said to all of us, come and watch the shooting. So we all gathered on Karan's set, and it wasn't really Karan's set. I think the film was made by Farah, but effectively it was Karan's set. And they were shooting a song which some of you may remember. It was called the Shava Shava song, in which the entire cast of Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum was required. But the way it works is, you then shoot for an hour, just close up, so one star doing it, and the others are free. So during this time, Joyita, who was one of the people who worked with us, saw Shah Rukh Khan hanging around on the sets and said to him, we are shooting for Star Talk. Do you want to come? So he apparently said yes. So she came and told me that Shah Rukh Khan has said yes, he will come, because we have a gap before we do Amitabh Bachchan. And I said, are you mad? She said, yeah, he'll turn up. So I said, we'll see. I'd never met Shah Rukh Khan before. And she said, in fact, he'll be here in 10, 15 minutes. So I ignored her. We were chatting when somebody drew my attention to the fact that in the guest chair, in those days, the set for Star Talk was a host chair and a guest chair. On the other side of the table, Shah Rukh Khan had arrived and was sitting there quietly, smoking his cigarette. Nobody had given him any special attention. He had just quietly slunk in. So I went in and I did the interview, and he was, as you probably know, he's an extremely bright man. He was completely charming, completely candid, completely honest. There were no starry hours and airs, and it ended up being a very, very good interview. Meanwhile, Joyita had seen Priyanka Chopra, who was then shooting her first film, wandering around. So she asked Priyanka if she would come and be interviewed. And I was a little iffy, because this was the person who had no movie releases, was just a beauty queen. But we took a chance on her, and she was so impressive that I remember saying to her, at the end of the interview on camera, you will be a very, very big star. And of course she is.
And then Amitabh also happened.
Yeah, Amitabh interview. I mean, I've done like so many
I'm saying
Amitabh
that on that day,
interviews. No better or no worse than any Amitabh interview.
No, but there's a remarkable cover story interview with Amitabh where he actually says that he got up at 4 o'clock in the morning and went across to Yash Chopra. I thought that
was cover story. Then after Star Talk, what happened was Star News, which is the channel we used to all appear on, became a Hindi channel. So they shifted my show to Star World, which some of you know, which is part of the same network. And because we now shot in Bombay and it was much more glamorous and sexy, they started calling it Cover Story. So we interviewed Amitabh for that. And actually that, you're right, is one of our better than average Amitabh interviews, because as some of you may know, there was a phase in his life when he was not just down and out, he was also bankrupt. He started this company called ABCL. ABCL had gone bust. He owed 200 crores plus maybe to the banks. The banks had attached his house. It could have been seized at any time. And then he bounced back. So I asked him the story of how he bounced back. And he said he was alone at home for many days. The phone had stopped ringing. Nobody would come to see him. There were no film offers. In fact, his films were flopping. All his conversations were about how to avert the banks from coming in and taking everything. And one day, desperately early in the morning, he walked to Yash Chopra's bungalow because Yash didn't live so far from him. And he arrived unannounced and said, listen, I'm down and out. I did some of my best films with you. Now I'd like to work with you again. And Yash Chopra called his son, Aditya was then not very well known. And they sat down and said, we have this subject called Mohabbatein. It's not exactly the hero's role. Shah Rukh will be the hero. Yours has got negative elements. Will you do it? And Amitabh said, I'll do anything you want. So he signed Mohabbatein. And then, by complete coincidence, Star came to him with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and said, will you be the host of this show? And he said, it's a game show. So they said, so what? It's a popular game show. So his kids, his wife, his whole family said to him, are you mad? You're Amitabh Bachchan. How can you become the host of a game show? And he said, no, I'll do it. And so, of course, that's how KBC happened. So between KBC and Mohabbatein, he was suddenly back to being Amitabh Bachchan.
Absolutely. And you're probably the only journalist who's known Amitabh Bachchan up close.
I'm sure many others. That was not true. I do not deny that there were phases in my life when I knew him closely, but I don't think I was the only one.
But now at this stage, he's 78 and he remains one of the biggest brands of the country. Yeah. What, according to you, explains this phenomenon and the endurance and the longevity of it?
Oh, some things that have nothing to do with him. One of them is his abundance of God-given gifts. There is that voice, which is God-given. There's also that presence when Amitabh Bachchan is on the screen. It doesn't matter what he's doing. The action could be being done by somebody else. He could just be the guy sitting on the side of the set or sitting, supposing two people are having a fight in the living room is the scene, and Amitabh is just sitting on a sofa watching it. You won't watch the fight. You'll watch Amitabh Bachchan. Amitabh has that God-given gift. He has that presence. You can't take your eyes off him when he's on screen. He's a very good actor. I don't think that's in any dispute. But it's not his acting that's made him Amitabh Bachchan alone. It's his presence. So I think those are the gifts. The rest of it is his own personality. He's very much a decent person. He's the person with the best manners in the film industry. He's a man of his word. If he tells you he will do something, he will do it. There was a phase when I first met him, when I wrote about him for India Today magazine, and this was 1980 probably. And in those days, films used to be shot, actors used to act in 6-7 films at the same time, and they used to shoot in shifts. So the early morning shift started at like 8 o'clock and went on till lunch. Nobody turned up at 8 o'clock. If you were Rajesh Khanna, you turned up at 2 o'clock after the set had ended. But everybody else, from Shashi Kapoor, had turned up about 2 hours, 3 hours late. Amitabh was the only person, he was the biggest star of the day, who would end up at 8, sit in his van, and wait for everyone to turn up. And they tell him, sir, it's not required. And he'll say, no, this is a shift. I've signed up for it. I will do it. So a lot of it is just strength of character, believing in certain things and sticking with it. At the end of the day, if you have that and you have stamina no matter what life throws at you. And God knows life has thrown all kinds of things at him. You survive.
So, because you've been somebody who's extensively done fascinating profiles of film stars through the ages.
Yeah.
For somebody, and now writing on films and writing on film personalities is a very, very attractive way in for journalists. What do you think are the basics for somebody aspiring to be that?
It depends on how you want to get into it. If you're a student of cinema, which I'm not, and you want to get into it by writing about the movies and how they're made, for a long time, you were better off writing about Bengali cinema, because in Hindi cinema, nobody cared about those things. But Hindi cinema has now changed. There are good directors. Films are made inventively and in a different way. So that's one way in. You do it from the perspective of a cinema buff. If you're interested in the stars, which, let's face it, most of us are, we're not really into the directors, then the best way to do it is to treat the stars as human beings. Don't treat them only as stars. Don't confess their screen characters with the real person. Try and find out what each star is about. Try and relate to them, because you'll have to meet them as individuals, and try and reveal them to your audiences, whether in profiles that you write or in interviews that you do as real people. I think that's the secret.
And looking back, if you were to pick one or two interviews or one or two profiles that worked better than you had thought?
I never do this. It's like asking somebody, who is your favorite child? I don't have a favorite city. I don't have a favorite cuisine. I don't have a favorite article. I don't have a favorite show. I don't have a best friend. I'm actually quite open to all things there.
So what happens when during a chat show or during an interview, things don't go as planned, which is very important for young journalists to know? If, say, for example, yeah. Absolutely.
Give me an example. No, what were you saying?
If you have a line of questioning which the person you're questioning reacts to or does not want to respond to, how do you deal with those situations, and what should somebody keep in mind?
Well, it depends. If you're going to interview a minister who's at the center of a scandal and he does not want to answer questions about the scandal, then you have no alternative but to find different ways of asking that question. There's the case of the famous British television interviewer, Jeremy Paxman, who asked the same question, I think, 18 different times in different ways, because he had to pay. Ultimately, the minister screwed himself, but he did it in a way in which he was able to trap the minister into talking. So if it's a serious interview and you're dealing with something that's really in the news, then I don't think you can avoid having to ask it. If, on the other hand, it's a light interview and you're asking somebody, let's say a star, and you know that there's been trouble in his early life, and it becomes very clear to you that he doesn't want to talk about the struggle, he doesn't want to talk about the early life, he wants to talk about his achievements, then you work out very quickly that going after his early life is going to be a fruitless endeavor, and you slowly, well, or not so slowly, change gears and get on to talking about what he wants to talk about, which is, say, the movies he's made. But don't do it in that predictable way in which he will give you the same answers he's given thousands of other people. Try and find new angles in which you can make that come alive.
And does that happen on the bedrock of research? Does it depend on the kind of hard yards you've done before the interview, or what does it depend on?
Well, I think the correct answer is it has to be research. You have to know. The honest answer in my case is I don't do much research. My perspective, some of them, I mean, they're very great interviews. Karan Thapar, for instance, who was an interview some of you may remember from the old days, his producer was my producer at one stage. And she said to me, you don't do any research? Karan used to do hours and hours of research. So yeah, I suppose he was much more conscientious than I was. But my approach to an interview is you should know a little bit more than the ordinary person knows. But if you know too much, it's as much of a disqualification as knowing too little, because then you ask questions where you think you know the answer and you've already planned the interview in your head. So there is no spontaneity. The point of an interview is that from the time the camera goes on to the half an hour afterwards or the 1 hour afterwards, anything can happen. You just have to steer it and make that hour or half an hour seem magical. It's not an exam paper where you go through the questions that you prepared for. Well, let's take what we're doing now. Sumit and I have known each other for years, but neither he nor I made any attempt to discuss what we were going to talk about. It has to be spontaneous.
So before taking in some audience questions, I wanted to round it off with the fact that you've seen it from, as I said, print to TV to Twitter, you've seen it all.
Yeah.
In the next few years, by the time those in today's audiences are entering the first jobs or are on the edge of it, what do you think will happen to the following in India? One, newspapers in India, news television in India.
Let's do one by one, because I'll forget by the time you finish, you got to point 5, I'll have forgotten point 1. What will happen to newspapers in India? I think newspapers will survive, but I think there is a problem in the way in which we've marketed newspapers in India. We followed a unique Indian model, which is that we charge nothing for our newspapers. We effectively give them away, and we treat the advertiser as our real customer. All our money comes from advertising. So people, when you give money, when you give newspapers away without charging money, people don't really respect the newspaper. Advertisers, on the other hand, also now shifting away because there's a multiplicity of media. So what will happen is the newspapers that worked on advertiser-driven economics will be in financial trouble. So the days of those huge circulations and printing lots and lots of copies and pulling down forests of trees to make the paper, I think those days are ending. People will read newspapers, but there will be people who are willing to pay for them, as you see in America or England, and it will be a much smaller audience. Okay, that was the second one.
News television in India.
I think news television will survive. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But it depends on how it survives and in what form it survives. We've seen the world of Hindi television, for instance, and now sadly in the world of English television also, that people are not that interested in news. Therefore, the obligation on news channels is to try and cover stories that would not normally be considered news, to try and do all kinds of entertainment in the name of news. And it works, but will it continue working? How long will it work? It works at the moment also because many of those channels are biased and take the side, say, of the government, which encourages them and gives them more room. But supposing the government changes, the same government will not be in power for the next 40 years or 50 years. It's doubtful that news television in this format will survive. Pure news television will always survive, just as CNN has and Fox News has, the BBC has, because there will always be somebody who will want news. But remember that news television will, like newspapers are fractured, also fracture. Like I did an interview yesterday with a journalist who'd been on a news television network and now ran her own operation. And the feedback I'd had from it is enormous. So you don't have to work for a big organization. You can do what Sumit did. He spent his life working for a big organization, but he now runs his own operation. He does his own things. Once upon a time, we'd have said, the moment he leaves ABP or Times of India or HT, he's finished. Nobody will give him a second look. It's not true. He's still Sumit. He's still, everybody takes his calls. He's still respected. He's still admired. So that world is changing. So the power of the talented journalist vis-a-vis the big newspaper organization is growing.
Third, online media.
Yeah, I think online is the future. There are problems with that because we've all discussed clickbait, short attention spans, stories that are going to be very short. So yes, there will be problems with online, but I mean, there are problems with anything. There's no point wishing it away. I know my own example. I look at the newspapers, but I no longer read them in detail in the morning. I go on my phone and I get what I want to know online. So if I, who's brought up in newspapers, does that, it'll be even worse for the average person.
But do you think the subscription model will come in? And
it will come in, but how much it will work, I don't know, because the New York Times, which I read every day, and the London Times, which I also read every day, has a subscription model, and it works. New York Times probably more successful But it works because people there don't mind paying for news. In India, because of the things I explained about this advertiser-driven economics, all of us have grown up to believe that news is free. So when you're told that you have to pay for news, there's a resistance. Maybe it'll take 5 years, 6 years for people to overcome that resistance. But I think eventually it will happen.
Okay. And is the difference in medium overemphasized in the minds of journalists? Switching from print to online, I see, is often a huge thing for people who spend their careers in print, while youngsters take to online because it's second nature to them. So for print journalists to remain relevant, do you think online is the only way?
Yeah, I don't see it in either or terms. For most of my career, I've written for print. Last 10 years, I've written online. And for the last 30 years, 20 years, 30 years, I've done television. Often, I've done all three simultaneously. So why should you have to choose? I mean, the world has changed. We live in a multimedia world. If you're going to be a journalist, be a multimedia journalist.
I'll just, a couple of questions. Subscription, yeah, I've asked. That was a question from Priyam Marik. Do you think a subscription model will actually work with Indian readers? There's another question saying, I'm a regular blogger and I want to be a journalist. How do I go about it?
Well, you can apply to ABP. I'm sure they'll give an address at the end of this program. It's not difficult.
Again, another general thing, what skills and what kind of discipline does one need to develop to become a good journalist?
Well, basically, you need to be able to think. I mean, there's this whole myth about great writing and what it's about. And sadly, it's, I think, even more in Calcutta than it is elsewhere, that you have to have very powerful English and you have to use big words and you have to write like Shakespeare, Chaucer, I have no idea. But I mean, that's nonsense. That's not actually relevant to journalism, maybe relevant to fiction. I don't even think they're auto literature. But basically, if you know how to think, if you can organize your thoughts, and ideally, if you can organize them in an interesting way, that's all you really need to know. People who write well, when you read an article and say, my God, that's a really good article, it's not because he's used big words or complicated constructions. It's because whatever message he or she who wrote it wants to get across has got across clearly. And that comes from clarity of thought. So whether you're on television, you're a blogger, even if you're on Twitter, but certainly if you're writing an article, just think clearly and distinctly. The problem with Indian journalism is not that people don't necessarily know English or whatever. It is that people don't think clearly. And our educational system, unfortunately, with its emphasis on textbooks and mugging, does not encourage that.
In terms of reading habits, you said you read. What are the newspapers that you generally track? Anything interesting?
I'll tell you what I get at home. I get at home the Indian Express, I get Business Standard, I get the Hindustan Times, I get the Times of India. I look online at the Times from London. I look online at the New York Times. I used to look online at the Washington Post, but it's a waste of money. So I've discontinued that. And to find out exactly what's happening, I will go on Indie TV first thing in the morning. So that would be my morning routine.
And do you look at specific papers for specific things, or just a flip through to find interesting things?
I certainly do that. For instance, because I'm interested in food, if it's the New York Times and there are sections, you can go to sections, I will click on the food section to find out what's been happening. I will click on the books section to find out what new books have come out. But I will do that throughout the day. In the morning, I'll go with the news.
So there's another question on, at the undergraduate level, would you rather that one studies journalism or something like an English history or sociology kind of thing, or political science and then go?
Yeah, I don't think it really matters what you study. Just do a good undergraduate degree. Don't do, I mean, it's not true journalism alone. I don't think you should do a professional qualification. I think you should do an undergraduate degree in some kind of specialization, whether it's history, as you say, or it's politics, or maybe even just English. But at least train your mind to have a work outside of your career. And then, if you want, you're most welcome to do journalism diploma or a short course afterwards. I'm not one of those people who believes that you should go straight from school into journalism school.
Another one is, how important is it to read fiction regularly to be a good journalist?
I think many people will tell you that when you read fiction, it broadens your mind. It gives your imagination room to roam. And because you've read fiction, your imagination and your worldview is greater than the worldview of people who have not read fiction. I know this because my wife keeps telling me this, because she's a journalist and she reads a lot of fiction. I, on the other hand, am a Philistine. I hardly ever read fiction. And frankly, I've done okay.
Another interesting one, do you think the writing for OTT platforms, great shows on OTT platforms, is now superior than any other form of writing? Scripts.
My God, this is only in ABP would I be asked this question. I remember in the 1990s being informed by Vir Sanghvi, who was my boss, that the great new art form was the television mini-series. So this is, I suppose, a modern version of the same question. No, I think, yes, we are, I don't know about OTT, we are certainly into the golden age of television. I don't think there has been television of this caliber in the West, not in India. I also think that because television has got so good, movies are now emphasizing spectacle. This is a bad period to talk about it, but in the days when people would go to the cinema, you had to give them something that didn't work on the small screen, and they had to go to the big screen for. So therefore, it was good to give them a Star Wars spin-off, good to give them the new Batman movie or the new Avengers movie. And these were fun. I mean, I watched them all the time, but they were not quite of the quality of, say, Homeland or any television mini-series or whatever. Now, I don't actually necessarily make the distinction between terrestrial television abroad and OTT. With The West Wing, which is probably the best television series the last 20 years, was done by an American TV network for terrestrial television. So the general question that, is television now doing the golden age? Yes. Do television shows have some great writing? Yes. Is that writing often superior to movies? Yes. Has that spread to India? Yes, in the sense that OTT shows in India are marginally better than Hindi movies, but only marginally.
There is a B part to that. Obviously, this is somebody who's serious about. There is so much more money in script writing in OTT for OTT platforms. Does it make sense to go into that rather than be a mere mainstream journalist?
I think if you have a flair for storytelling and you enjoy writing fiction, whether this is a screenplay or a script or whatever, of course you should do it.
This is the other side. Do you think starting out in print is a good foundation in terms of journalism in today's time before branching out into other things?
I think so, but then I would say that because I started in print. But frankly, if you look at all the great journalists of today across genres, some were in print, some were not in print. Rajdeep Sardesai actually worked for the Telegraph for ABP. Arnab Goswami worked for the Telegraph and for ABP. But Parkada went directly to NDTV. So I think it helps some cases, it doesn't help in many cases. So I would not generalize.
And the questions are keeping on coming. I think, yeah. Over to you, Vir. Your last thoughts on your final thoughts before we wrap up, and anything that you want to share with youngsters who...
No, just the obvious things, which is that you are doing a degree which will qualify you for a profession that is in a certain degree of peril. If you were doing this degree 20 years ago, I would not be saying this to you. The good news is that 20 years ago, there was just You could only join print, join ABP, or join the Times of India. Now there are many, many other options. So it's a glass half full and a glass half empty situation. You can look at yourselves as joining a profession that is in crisis, or you can look at yourselves as people joining a profession where there are many, many options that were absent when, say, my generation or even Sumit's generation started out. You can do things on your own. You can work in television. You can work on the internet, you can create things, you can do different things. So embrace the multiplicity of media. Do not see yourselves. In the old days, people used to go to Presidency College, join the Statesman, and die one day at the Statesman. Those days are over. This is now a vibrant world, a multimedia world. And look at it that way and feel fortunate that you're born into that world.
Thank you so much, Vir. Thank you for your time.
I enjoyed doing it. Thanks, everyone. I hope I didn't bore you too much with my long, rambling stories.
Thanks a lot, and look forward to catching up in Calcutta.
Absolutely. See you soon. See you in Cal. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye.